John the Baptist could have hoodwinked those who thought he might be the Messiah. But instead, in humility, he chose the way of truth. As the people were filled with expectation, and all were questioning in their hearts concerning John whether he might be the Messiah, John answered them by saying, "I baptize you with water, but one who is more powerful than I is coming. I am not worthy to untie the thong of his sandals. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire." He pointed to Jesus as the Messiah when he could have easily stolen that honor for himself. When we are humble, that's what we do. Our words and actions point beyond us to God. The humble man is less concerned with himself and more concerned with others. As C.S. Lewis said, humility doesn't mean thinking less of yourself, it means thinking of yourself less. The humble servant is attentive to the master and draws attention to him rather than to himself. And the priest is a servant. One of the great dangers for a priest is that they can lose sight of this reality. Parishioners often think we're special and they have a high regard for us. And this can cause us to start believing that we're actually as special as they think we are, imagining that it's us rather than Christ that attracts them. Pride, therefore, is an occupational hazard for any priest. Hence, we need to work on humility. And it all begins here in this sacred building. If we're humble here in formation, it is more likely after ordination that we'll be like John the Baptist, pointing to Jesus, the one who people actually need, rather than to ourselves. Please forgive the messenger this morning as I look at some practical ways in which we can live with greater humility at St. Augustine's. I say this because humility is not exactly my strong suit. I know that full well, and so do you, who must live with me. As I sometimes say, if it wasn't for false humility, I wouldn't have any humility at all. But in all seriousness, though, I need to heed what I myself am saying this morning and try, in spite of my own limitations and perfections, to actualize it here in our daily life. So these are some thoughts on living humility better here at our seminary home. Firstly, think best about your brothers. As you look at so many saints in our holy church, they all seem to say the same thing, either in word or deed. Think well about others, imagining them to be even better than yourself. I found when I put this into practice, I'm not only correct, I mean about them being better than me, but I feel much more at peace. If we think well of others, it's easier to serve them. It's when we're suspicious of them that it seems onerous to seek their good. And being generous in our thoughts about others gives us greater peace as we attempt to straighten out our own internal messes rather than worrying about others' limitations. And perhaps that's why St. Therese could utter these remarkable words: "God alone is our rest. The only joy which lasts is solely in contempt of self. Happiness can be found only in believing others are virtuous and we are imperfect." She goes on, "Those who judge are really the losers. Is there anything sweeter than thinking well of others?" Only worry about what God thinks of you. You are who you are in God's eyes, that and no more. When you're at the seminary, it can be a real temptation to try to appear a certain way, especially because, for better or worse, seminarians are being evaluated. A necessity for assuring that only the best and fittest men serve the people of God. It's kind of part and parcel of reality here. Humility is the virtue that gives us the freedom to take our masks off without fear, because the humble person is not concerned with what others think about him. He is forgetful of self. The proud man, on the other hand, is always concerned with what others think, And if he doesn't have their approval, he is saddened and listless. If your happiness relies on the approval of anyone other than Jesus Christ, you are setting yourself up for a very painful fall. You cannot be a priest for anyone but God alone. Yielding to others. It's not always easy to yield to others because sometimes we want to put our desires and ideas ahead of other people's ideas and preferences. But before I talk about yielding, maybe a little caveat is in order. If you're the kind of person who can't say no, the kind of person who should say no sometimes because it would be a prudent and even commendable decision, then you might have to do the opposite of what I say. You might have to work at asserting yourself more and yielding less. After a stint at Southdown, I spoke with a priest who was there, and he told me that he had actually been there because he had a nervous breakdown. What was the cause? He blamed the seminary. Pretty interesting. So what was the problem, I asked him. He said, the seminary never taught me to say no. They always said, just say yes. God's grace will be with you. The Holy Spirit will guide you. You'll be full of everything and love and fullness, and you can say yes to everything. Don't say no. So you can say no. You've got my permission. I don't want anyone here ever saying that. You can say no. You should sometimes, because it's actually a yes very often. However, most of us, I think, myself included, could do with a little more yielding rather than more assertiveness. St. Paul, in his letter to the church in Rome, challenges them too with these words: let them vie with one another in showing honor. Yielding to others is not abject submission. It's a concrete way of demonstrating respect and love. Yielding takes humility, and you will be doing a lot of that one day as a priest. So the seminary is great practice. As an associate, believe me, you will be yielding to your pastor a lot. Your letter of appointment will make that clear. You're going to have to yield to the bishop over and over again. And when you're pastor, that doesn't actually mean you get to call all the shots. Unless you want to come off as a know-it-all bore, you're going to have to yield to people's needs, the staff's concerns, as well as volunteers, teachers, principals, pretty well, you name it. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about yielding on matters that are important, the fundamentals of faith, morality, non-negotiables like these. I'm talking about not always having to be right and asserting our preferences over others in matters of praxis, opinion, or preference. And finally, be patient. A humble man is patient. Proud people tend to be impatient because they already have all the correct answers to life's questions, and they just want them to be carried out by those around them because everyone can then be happy. Pretty straightforward. Let us be patient with one another. It builds goodwill. Let us work at it because there are many crosses in community. Here are a string of words that Saint Benedict uses in his rule to describe the challenges that a monk must face in community. Some of them will sound familiar to your life here. Hard things, unfavorable things, undeserved things, suffering, testing, examination by fire, being led into a trap, tribulations, people over one's head, adversity, being struck on the cheek, having your coat stolen, forced to walk a mile, false brethren, persecution, being cursed. With the possible exception of coat stealing, very little has changed in a millennium and a half of community life. Trials are part and parcel of living with one another. Everyone's life has a cross in it. Everyone's life has a cross in it. So let us not be surprised that we will have crosses and challenges here as well. Living patience, however, is the key to dealing with our crosses, because when we suffer patiently, we're uniting ourselves to the cross of Christ. To be faithful and patient, despite the shortcomings and sinfulness of others, is actually a beautiful offering in God's sight. with patience, difficulties can become opportunities for sanctification. So, contrary to everything our culture would tell us, humility is actually a strong virtue. It keeps us in the truth. It keeps us behaving naturally. It brings peace to other people around us, and it sanctifies both them and us. It makes us, humility that is, the kind of people who can be happy with God forever.